The morning sun pushed pale light through the cracks of an old wooden barn, where dust hung in the air like suspended gold. Outside, a tabby cat named Willow crouched protectively, her body curled around two tiny shapes that were anything but ordinary. They weren't kittens. They were lion cubs, no bigger than her own body, their spotted coats still damp from the dew outside. When Farmer John Harris opened the barn door, his boots crunching against the hay, he froze mid-step. The sight before him didn't just surprise him, it made his breath catch in disbelief. For a moment, John thought his eyes were betraying him. Willow, the gentle barn cat who had raised litter after litter of kittens, was purring softly while nudging the cubs closer with her nose. Their small paws pressed against her belly, as if they had been hers all along. John's heart pounded. He glanced around the barn, half expecting a lioness to appear from the shadows. But the silence was heavy, broken only by the tiny mewls of the cubs. The contrast was almost surreal. A small domestic cat, fragile yet fierce, guarding the young of one of the world's most feared predators. Word spread quickly. By midday, John's wife and two neighbors had gathered at the barn entrance, whispering in disbelief as they watched the scene. The cubs whimpered and crawled closer to Willow's warmth, their massive paws out of place against her delicate frame. The neighbors murmured about danger, about calling the authorities, but no one dared to interrupt the strange, tender ritual unfolding in front of them. The barn smelled of straw and milk, and in that quiet corner, it felt as if nature had broken all its own rules. John crouched low, his rough hands trembling as he reached out, testing Willow's reaction. She hissed softly at him, not out of aggression, but warning her message clear. "These are mine now." He pulled his hand back, stunned. The protective gleam in her green eyes reminded him of any mother defending her young, no matter the species. For a moment, time seemed to slow, and John realized he was witnessing something no one would believe unless they saw it themselves. The cubs wriggled against Willow's fur, making faint growls that sounded more like hiccups. She licked their faces with steady strokes, her rasping tongue smoothing the wildness out of them, as if trying to tame nature itself. The sight drew a gasp from John's wife, who pressed her hand to her mouth. It wasn't just unusual, it was breathtaking. Something primal stirred in the barn, a reminder that love and protection didn't always respect boundaries. Still, unease clung to John's chest. He knew lions didn't simply vanish, and the presence of these cubs meant their mother couldn't be far. Every sound outside, the caw of a crow, the distant crack of branches made him glance toward the fields with nervous anticipation. Yet, despite the risk, he couldn't bring himself to disturb Willow. She had chosen this role, and the cubs had chosen her. Somehow, it felt wrong to interfere. As the day shifted into evening, the barn grew cooler, and the animals inside huddled closer together. Willow purred louder, a steady vibration that filled the space like a lullaby. The cubs quieted under her care, their breathing syncing with hers in a rhythm that spoke of safety. John sat on a stool nearby, arms crossed, unable to look away. What had begun as shock was slowly transforming into awe. But beneath that awe lurked a sharper thought. This peace couldn't last. Sooner or later, the world outside would notice. The cubs would grow, the dangers would mount, and questions would demand answers. For now, though, the scene inside the barn glowed like a secret miracle, a fragile bubble of tenderness on the edge of bursting. And as darkness fell, John realized he was no longer just a witness, he was now a protector too. The next morning, the barn was alive with soft sounds, the tiny growls of the cubs, the steady purr of Willow, and the rustling of straw as they nestled close. Sunlight cut through the slats, painting stripes across their unlikely family. John Harris stood in the doorway, still uncertain whether to intervene, but what he saw froze him in place. Willow had stretched her small body so the cubs could nurse, even though she had little milk left. She didn't push them away. Instead, she guided them, her tail curling protectively around their backs. The image was tender, almost sacred, as though instinct had rewritten itself overnight. The cubs were clumsy, their paws oversized, their movements uncoordinated. One stumbled onto Willow's flank, pressing too hard, but she only shifted slightly, tolerating the discomfort. She began licking his ears, her rough tongue rasping over the fur until he melted into her side with a sigh. The second cub rested his head on her chest, blinking up at her as if she were his true mother. John's chest tightened. He whispered to himself, how is this even possible? But Willow's steady gaze silenced any doubt. Still, whispers of fear crept in. What if the cubs grew faster than Willow could handle? Already their claws were sharper than her own kittens had ever been. John watched as one stretched against her belly, his paw grazing her face. For a split second, it looked dangerous, his nails so close to her eye. But Willow didn't flinch. Instead, she nudged his paw gently aside, teaching him boundaries the way only a mother could. The barn filled with warmth, but also with tension, as if each tender moment could tilt into risk at any second. That afternoon, John's wife brought a small bowl of milk, placing it near Willow to help her keep her strength. The smell of it filled the air, and the cubs lifted their heads, noses twitching. Willow lapped first, then stepped back, allowing the cubs to try. Their rough tongues splashed milk everywhere, tiny growls echoing as they jostled for space. The sight made John's wife laugh, though her eyes shimmered with worry. "They're growing," she whispered, almost to herself. Growth meant strength, but also danger, two worlds colliding under one fragile roof. By evening, the barn had transformed into a cradle of contrasts. The delicate sound of purring mixed with the deeper, almost primal rumble of the cubs. Willow curled tighter around them, creating a living barrier between their wild nature and the fragile safety of the farm. John leaned against the wall, the scent of hay in his nose, sweat cooling on his brow. His thoughts spiraled. What if the lioness was out there, searching? What if the cubs grew too quickly, their instincts outpacing Willow's gentle guidance? The unknown pressed on him like the weight of the night sky. And then, a sudden noise shattered the calm, a low growl from outside the barn. John stiffened, his heart hammering. The cubs stirred, ears twitching, sensing something familiar beyond the walls. Willow's fur bristled as she stood, her body arching, her tiny frame suddenly fierce against the vastness of what might be lurking nearby. John grabbed the pitchfork, leaning by the door, though he knew it would do little against what he feared most. Every second dragged, the growl echoing in his head. But the sound faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by the distant howl of a coyote crossing the fields. Relief swept through John like a crashing wave, but his hands still trembled. He turned back to Willow, who had already settled down again, purring loudly to soothe her restless cubs. She licked their heads until they drifted back into sleep, their sides rising and falling in rhythm with hers. To them, she was the only world that mattered. John lowered himself to the hay, exhaustion finally catching up to him. As he watched Willow guard her adopted young with such unshakable devotion, he realized something profound. This wasn't just survival, this was trust. Willow had accepted what no one else dared to believe possible. And in that barn, against all odds, the fiercest predator and the gentlest protector had become one family, though the world outside still threatened to break that fragile peace. 3 nights later, the barn was no longer just a shelter, it had become a battlefield of instincts. The cubs were growing fast, their bodies heavier, their play turning rougher. One pounced on the other, their small roars echoing against the wooden beams, sharp and guttural. Willow darted between them, batting them gently with her paw, scolding them with a hiss that carried no fear. She was still in control, but John, watching from the shadows, could see the imbalance forming. Their paws were nearly the size of her head. The question burned in his mind. How long could she keep them in line? That same evening, a storm rolled in. Rain drummed against the tin roof, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and ozone. The cubs grew restless, pacing in circles, their energy unchecked. Thunder cracked, startling them, and one let out a louder growl than before, low and resonant. Willow pressed herself against him, purring fiercely, as if her tiny body could anchor his wildness. But when he swiped at the straw, claws tearing deep grooves into the wooden floor, John's stomach clenched. These weren't kittens anymore, they were lions in disguise. Outside, the night carried an even darker threat. John spotted movement at the edge of the field, a shadow larger than a coyote, gliding with purpose through the rain. His throat went dry. A lioness. She was out there. The cubs stiffened as if they could sense her presence, their ears twitching toward the distant rustle of grass. Willow arched her back, tail flicking, her green eyes locked on the doorway. Though small, she stood as if she could defend her strange family against the whole wild world. John gripped his flashlight tighter, every nerve alive. The lioness didn't come closer, not yet. She circled at a distance, a silhouette swallowed by darkness and rain. But her presence was undeniable, a storm inside the storm. John's pulse pounded in his ears. If she entered the barn, Willow wouldn't stand a chance. Neither would he, truth be told. He whispered under his breath, pleading to the night, hoping she would retreat. Instead, the cubs whimpered, torn between the pull of the mother outside and the comfort of the mother within. Willow reacted before John could move. She curled her body tighter around the cubs, licking their heads as though sealing them to her with every stroke. The barn filled with her steady purr, louder than it had ever been, vibrating against the thunder. It wasn't just comfort, it was defiance. She was telling the cubs, and perhaps even the lioness beyond the fields, "You are safe here." John's chest ached at the sight. It was bravery distilled into the smallest of forms. But then, the lioness's call shattered the night, a deep, resonant roar that rattled the barn walls. The cubs cried out, their tiny voices rising in confusion. They scrambled toward the door, claws scratching the wood, desperate to reach the sound that pulled at their blood. Willow leapt in front of them, hissing, striking the floor with her paw. She blocked the exit with her whole being, even as they pressed against her. John's hand shook as he held the latch shut from the other side, praying it would hold if the lioness charged. The rain thickened, drowning the farm in sheets of silver. The barn smelled of fear and wet fur, every sense sharpened to the breaking point. John could hear his own heartbeat, rapid and relentless, as the lioness paced just beyond sight. The cubs wailed, torn between two worlds, while Willow's body shook with effort as she restrained them. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within, each thunderclap a reminder that the fragile miracle of this family could collapse in an instant. Minutes passed like hours, until at last the lioness's steps grew fainter. She was retreating, melting back into the wild from where she came. The cubs whimpered, confused and restless, but Willow didn't release her guard until silence truly returned. Only then did she curl back around them, licking away their panic as if nothing had happened. John slumped against the barn wall, drenched in sweat despite the cold. The crisis had passed for now. But he knew this was just the beginning. Nature would return. And when it did, the fragile bond inside this barn would face its greatest test. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the barn like the smell of rain-soaked earth. Willow lay curled once more. The cubs pressed tightly against her, their sides rising and falling in unison. John sat on a wooden stool nearby, exhaustion heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the image of the lioness circling outside, her roar carving through the night. Yet here, in this fragile pocket of safety, a smaller roar had prevailed, not of power, but of love. Willow had refused to surrender. Against every instinct written into nature, she had chosen to keep them. Morning light seeped through the cracks, spilling gold over the straw. The cubs stirred, playful again, batting at each other with paws already too large for the space they lived in. Willow tolerated their roughness, stepping between them when claws came too close to her eyes. Then something remarkable happened. One cub, the bolder of the two, climbed onto her back, kneading her fur the way kittens do. Willow purred so deeply the sound filled the entire barn. For the first time, John felt the tension ease completely, replaced by a wonder that left him speechless. Days turned into a week. Each morning, John checked the fields, fearing the return of the lioness, but the grass lay empty. It was as if she had entrusted her cubs to another mother, unseen but certain. Perhaps she sensed what John now knew for sure. Willow wasn't just keeping the cubs alive. She was raising them, teaching them gentleness with every lick, patience with every nudge, love with every heartbeat pressed against theirs. The wild had bent, if only for a moment, to let this impossible bond take root. Yet John also knew this chapter could not last forever. The cubs were growing stronger each day, their play louder, their paws heavier against the wooden floor. Soon, they would outgrow the barn, outgrow Willow, and the world would come calling. He thought of the authorities, of wildlife rescuers who might one day need to take them. The thought stung. He wanted to protect this miracle, to keep it hidden, but he also knew that miracles were never meant to be owned. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the horizon, John witnessed a moment that etched itself into his soul. Willow lay stretched on her side, eyes half closed in peace. The cubs, now stronger and more restless, pressed close to her. One of them, with paws already broader than her face, leaned down and licked her cheek with clumsy tenderness. Willow blinked slowly, accepting the gesture, then rested her head against his chest. It was the first time the roles had shifted, the child caring for the mother. John's throat tightened. He knew this was the symbol of everything they had built together. The farm grew quieter as night fell. Crickets sang outside, and the barn smelled of hay and warm fur. John sat silently, not wanting to disturb the sacred scene unfolding just feet away. The world might never fully understand what had happened here, but he did. He had witnessed fear turn to devotion, wildness turn to tenderness, and a line between species dissolve into something stronger. He realized he wasn't just protecting animals, he was guarding proof that compassion has no boundaries. That night, for the first time since the cubs had arrived, John slept peacefully. He knew danger would return eventually, but he also knew that love had already written itself into these walls, into these hearts. Willow had done the impossible. She had raised not kittens, but lions, with nothing but her small body and boundless instinct. And in doing so, she had tamed not just predators, but fear itself. When dawn returned, painting the sky in pale pink, John opened the barn door to find Willow and the cubs asleep in a perfect circle. Their breaths rose and fell as one, their bodies tangled together in trust. He stood silently, not daring to move, letting the image carve itself into his memory. This was the ending no one had expected, the ending no one could forget. A cat who had raised lions, and in the process, reminded everyone who saw it that love, pure, stubborn love, can rewrite the laws of nature.